Welcome back to the Apiary, a knitting podcast. In today's episode, we are talking about building the skills that will help you feel confident enough to tackle your first pair of hand knit socks. For some reason, socks have taken up a place in the knitting world as this kind of strangely intimidating project. But I promise you, odds are high that you already have the skills that you need to knit socks. If you're feeling intimidated by them though, I promise you, we can get you there. If we haven't met yet, hi, I'm Lauren. I design knitting patterns with a focus on accessories, especially socks. Socks are my love. I love designing socks. And so in today's episode, we're going to be talking about all of the things that you can do to make sure that you feel confident and ready to tackle hand knit socks. So step one in building the skills to knit a sock might be a little bit of surprise, and it's actually knit a hat. Because the thing about hats is they have a lot of the things that you're already going to need to knit a sock. You've got decreases at the crown that look an awful lot like the decreases at the toe of a sock. They've got knitting in the round, maybe some textured stitches, and ribbing at the bottom. Different kinds of ribbing even. Look at that, I've got a plain 1x1 rib and a twisted 1x1 rib. Knitting a hat is a great way to start building the skills for knitting a sock because you are using those skills, but you're doing it with thicker yarn and bigger needles. That means it's easier to see your stitches, easier to see your mistakes, easier to fix things. And if things go catastrophically sideways and you have to rip out your work and start over again, you haven't invested quite as much time. The thickness of hat yarn is also beneficial because if the thing about knitting a sock that intimidates you is the teeny tiny yarn on the teeny tiny needles, well, you don't have to worry about that here. This one, you're just working on the skill building without having to worry about the tiny yarn and needles. Now, step two in building the skills to knit a pair of socks might surprise you even more than step one because it is knit another hat. But these hats are different. These hats are knit with fingering weight yarn. That's the yarn that you're going to use for most sock patterns on teeny tiny needles. So now we have taken the skills that you built with your bigger hats where you worked on knitting in the round, doing ribbing at the brim, closing down the crown, and now you're doing those same skills with the teeny tiny yarn and the teeny tiny needles. This is actually a free pattern over on my blog. I will drop the link down in the description below. Step three in building the skills to knit a hat involves shrinking down the circumference of your work. So when you're knitting the hats, you still have a fairly large circumference of your project, right? Which means you can still use the regular circular knitting needles that you're used to using. Once you get down to knitting socks, you're going to have to change up your technique a little bit. You can't use the same needles you've been using, at least not the same way you've been using them. So step three involves experimenting with lots of different techniques for small circumference knitting until you find the technique that works best for you and your unique brain. Because we're all different, right? We're all different knitters. We have different brains. We have different hands. And so we're going to enjoy different kinds of small circumference knitting. So here's an example of me experimenting with a new technique. I am primarily a 9-inch circular sock knitter. I like using teeny tiny little circular knitting needles that are like this big around and their needle tips are this long. But I wanted to build some new skills over the last year. So I learned how to do magic loop. I tried out the flexi flips, and now I'm knitting a pair of socks on 2 circular needles. So this is a new technique for me. So if you're working on building the skills for knitting a pair of socks, what I would recommend is casting on maybe about 20 stitches and practicing knitting that little tube using double pointed needles, magic loop, 2 circulars, and flexi flips. And if none of those feel good, then I would suggest casting on about 50 to 60 stitches and trying on a 9-inch circular needle. The one drawback of the 9-inch circulars, of course, is that they cannot go down to the smallest circumference that you might need to close up the toe of your socks. So you're still going to need to know how to use either double pointed needles, magic loop, or 2 circulars, maybe flexi flips, in order to get that toe down small enough. Don't be afraid to experiment and don't feel bad if you just can't figure out one of those methods. It took me a decade to learn magic loop. I'm not even joking and I'm not exaggerating. I kept trying over and over the course of years and it threw my head for a loop every time until last July when suddenly things just clicked. So if one method of knitting small circumference works great for your best friend, but it doesn't work for you, you're not wrong, you're not broken, you're not a bad knitter, you just need something else, and that's okay. Step 4 of building the skills to knit socks comfortably is to knit a really big, thick, fat sock. So these socks, I'll hold them up closer so you can see how big the stitches are. These are knit using worsted weight yarn. And you can see compared to the fingering weight yarn I'm using here, you can see how much bigger those stitches are. This is a much bigger stitch than this is. Now, there's a reason I recommend practicing with worsted weight yarn when you knit your first sock. And it's because, as with the hats, the yarn is thicker and the needles are bigger, so you can see your stitches more easily. You can see the different components of the sock more easily. You can see and fix mistakes more easily. And if things go really badly sideways and you have to rip it all out, you haven't invested as much time in it. Now, I do have this as a free pattern up on my blog as well, and I will also link this down in the description below. I think a vanilla worsted weight sock is a really fun project, even if you're not a new sock knitter, because it's kind of a palate cleanser, right? Do you remember that scene in The Princess Diaries where Mia is going to that fancy state dinner and they put the little dish of what looks like a beautiful dessert in front of her and she doesn't realize it's cold and she takes a big scoop and starts panicking because now she's given herself brain freeze? That's what I think of every time I think of palate cleansers. This is not going to give you brain freeze. This is just a relaxing sock knit. So if it's your very first sock, it does a lot of hand holding. It's going to guide you through all of the steps. If you've knit a bunch of socks, but you just want someone else to do the math for you so you don't have to think about it, I got you covered. Step 5 of this process is probably the part that you could most easily anticipate, and it's knit some socks. Because by the time you've completed step 4, you have everything you need to knit these guys right here. You have all the basic mechanical skills because you can knit in the round, you can work ribbing, and you can do decreases. You have the yarn technical skills. You can use teeny tiny needles with teeny tiny yarn. You know what kind of small circumference knitting you prefer. And you've already knit a big, thick, chunky sock, or 2, or 10. At this point, you know what you're doing. It's just putting it all together, and you can do that. But if there are technique issues that are still puzzling you, please feel free to drop them in the comments below. I'm happy to answer questions, or if it's a more detailed thing that needs a video follow-up, I can do a follow-up episode. Otherwise, go forth and knit socks. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time.